So in this course, we've been talking about historiography, and we've been describing historiography as a conversation among historians. In other words, how the different historians see the stories that they're telling and how they relate to each other and how they differ from one another. What we want to spend a little bit of time on here in the screencast is looking for ways to recognize the different voices that we encounter in the text. The most obvious voices there are the voices of the author, the person writing the text, but also, of course, of the author's evidence, the primary sources that the author is using to convince you of how he tells the story or how she tells the story. What I'd like to look for here is how to spot the author's voice in that conversation. Because I've seen a number of you in your first essays, but also in the forums, misrecognizing some of the author's voices in the text. I think it's a useful thing for you to think about as you work through this course. Let's look at this source. It's on women immigrants in the 19th century from a textbook. This is an essay by an historian from Queen's University by the name of Jane Arrington. And in this essay, she considers the role of female immigrants in the 19th century. But I want you to see there's a number of things going on here, even in this first page and a half, and there's a number of voices happening here. So let's look at this really, really quickly. You can go back and read this more carefully later if you wish. I just want to point to you some basic things here. So she begins with this lines from a song, a 19th century song, which describes the immigrant experience of immigrants crossing the Atlantic. And she makes the point that this is kind of part of a British view of the 19th century of how the colonial world was being shaped. And what she also wants to emphasize here, and she draws attention to this right here, she says, the heroes of these tales were men. And now remember, we're reading an article about women, so that, that strikes us as maybe as an important point. Context matters here. And she gives us a couple of quick examples here of some women that are seen there, despite the fact that these stories seem to be all about men. And then she makes a point about the scholarship, in other words, about the conversation, right, the historiographical conversation. Recent scholarship has begun to tickle out the complex and diverse roles British women played in creating and defining the British imperial world. And there's an increasing body of literature that chronicles female migration to the settler colonies, particularly in the Antipodes, that's Australia and New Zealand. Notice there's a footnote there that she's pointing you towards that literature, that conversation, right? Then she says, with few exceptions, immigration to British America in the first half of the 19th century continues to be characterized as the migration of nuclear families and adventurous men. Women's voices and their participation in the process is at best muted, or by implication of no consequence. In other words, what she's pointing to there is the historiography, the literature that exists on British North America in this time period. And she says, by and large, that literature says women aren't very important. Okay? So that's kind of setting up the question. She says, what then do we make? She asks a question. She finds some evidence that contradicts that. What then do we make of the notice that appeared in the local Kingston Upper Canadian newspaper, which tells a story of this woman looking for her husband, she's arriving 3 years after he left, and they've lost contact with one another. And she gives another couple of quick examples here. And then she says, but those are just a couple of quick examples. You might say, well, those are just kind of weird things. But she says, no, between 1815 and 1845, local newspapers in Upper Canada and throughout North America printed hundreds of similar notices. And she gives another couple of quick examples here. She says there's possibilities here for how we think about these, but she wants to get to women here, because this is what her essay is about, right? She says there's all kinds of things we can think about from these notices, useful things that these notices might provide. But she then says they also include tantalizing hints of immigrants' expectations of the New World and suggest that although absent in the imperial discourse, women were actively engaged in the colonial project. In other words, they're an important part of the story. They're not just kind of being brought along because they have to, because their husbands are dragging them or whatever. It's because they are participating on their own, that they are engaging in their own, they're showing agency in this, that they're their own actors in this story. So there's some different voices. There's the author's voice right there, the author's voice. There's the author's voice engaging with the historiography over here. And then there's the voices of the evidence. So we've got two levels of secondary sources, the author herself in this case, and the author she's engaging with. And then we've got the author's of the primary sources that are involved here. So there's different things going on there, different voices, and spotting those voices can be helpful. I want to finish this with a quick example from your text that a number of you misinterpreted. And I think this is just another quick example to look for voices. This is Atkinson. This is in our chapter from Irish immigration. And this is Atkinson from the very, very beginning. And his introduction is quite long, and he's trying to make a number of historiographical points. But the first one directly ties to the reading you just did. So a number of you may be writing your essay on this one, on this chapter, and you'll remember that Pentland, H.C. Pentland, talked about Irish immigrants and emphasizing the fact that they were unskilled and they were doing the kind of rough work because they were not ready to farm. They didn't know how to farm. They weren't able to farm. So that's why they went off and did all this kind of dangerous work in the canals and things like that. So it gives you the suggestion that Irish Catholic immigrants in the 19th century had low skills and were not interested in farming. So he's kind of speaking to their character and their kind of social expectations. Read Atkinson here. He says, a central strand of the historiography of the Irish Catholics in America explains that they settled largely in cities, right, not on farms, because they were incapable of doing otherwise. And he says, sometimes noted, but not really kind of seen as deviance from the norm, not really kind of part of the pattern. And so then he gives an example. Look, it begins with a quotation mark. Unequipped to cope with the challenges of large-scale American farming and unwilling to confront the isolation of existence and vastness of rural America, most Irish immigrants preferred to congregate in cities as the pioneers of the American urban ghetto. And that's very much what Pentland's saying, right? These are the people that will do the dog work. These are the people that will work for low wages. These are the people that will be the poor working class of the emerging industrial society. But what we need to be focusing on here is that Atkinson isn't saying this. He's saying, this person said, Lawrence McCaffrey says this. And this quote continues. It goes all the way down to where it ends here, but it's a longish quote. And he's making the point that other historians make this argument. And what you're going to find as you read this essay, that he actually shows that Irish Catholic settlers farmed on roughly the same proportion as Irish Protestant settlers did. In other words, there's no real big difference there. In other words, there's no good evidence for this view. So look at exactly what's going on here. This is Atkinson. He's our author. He's not saying this. McCaffrey is saying this. But he's saying this is where the historiography is. This is where the conversation is. I'm going to take us in a different direction. And you'll see that over the course of the essay, he takes you in a very different direction. So that's some basic things to think about, some things to try to spot who is speaking in the text at a particular point in time. Sometimes this is really obvious. He'll say, like Atkinson does here, McCaffrey elaborates. He tells you this is somebody else's voice. But sometimes it's a little more subtle, as it was in the previous example, where she's just pointing to the historiography and saying, this is kind of the way the conventional story is being told. Still, there's a sense there of showing you, the reader, where the author is in relationship to that conversation. These people are saying these things, and now I'm going to say this. And that might agree with the conversation, it might disagree with the conversation, but it's somehow participating in the conversation. We see patterns, we criticize those patterns, we agree with those patterns, we engage with the conversation in some manner.